Throughout the long history of MotoGP, there have been many instances of riders refusing to race at a circuit. The vast majority of these rider strikes happened in the 70s and 80s, when rider safety was still evolving and riders began to hold organized strikes when they felt they were being forced to go out in unsafe conditions. Although there are still issues today, fortunately, we are in a much better era for rider safety than we were 40 years ago. And as a result, rider strikes are basically a thing of the past. However, there was one rider strike which was attempted much more recently and was unlike any other we've ever seen. The track wasn't dangerous, the weather wasn't wet, but there were fears of something else. Nuclear radiation. My name is B, this is the Beehive Paddock, and today we're talking about the story of the 2011 Japanese Grand Prix, MotoGP's nuclear scare. Now, I am not a nuclear energy expert by any means, but I will try and break this down as best as possible. But I implore you to do further research from more educated sources if you want to know more about this event. Let's start with some background. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake occurred off the coast of Japan. It was the fourth most powerful earthquake ever recorded. Soon after, a tsunami triggered by the quake hit the eastern coast of the nation. It has been estimated that over 1 million buildings were damaged in the incident, with over 120,000 having totally collapsed. As a result of the earthquake and tsunami, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant completely lost power. With their backup power sources also having been damaged, this meant multiple reactors lost the ability to cool properly, resulting in a release of potential nuclear contaminants into the surrounding area and the evacuation of over 100,000 Japanese citizens. Nuclear power is the energy equivalent of airline travel. Statistically, it's one of the safest ways to get the job done. But when it does go wrong, the consequences are dramatic and can be disastrous. This is why airplane crashes and nuclear accidents make headlines. They're rare and dramatic, and that's a great basis for a headline. But it can also mean that things get blown out of proportion and seem a lot worse than they are. To help with this, the International Atomic Energy Agency introduced the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale to help categorize nuclear power-related accidents. They even put it in a fun little pyramid so idiots like us can understand it. Level 0 at the very bottom is basically any time something out of the ordinary happens at a nuclear power site. As you climb the pyramid, you see events with more severe consequences, from incidents with minimal consequences to incidents with consequences on the surrounding environment. Finally, at the top, you reach level 7, reserved for full-on nuclear disasters, the most famous of these being Chernobyl. You may have heard of it. For decades, Chernobyl was the only level 7 disaster, until Fukushima was categorized as the second ever level 7 disaster. See, the scale ends at 7, there is no higher number, but the gap between the two events in level 7 is pretty damn big. In fact, it's estimated that Fukushima released 80 to 90% less radioactive material into the air than Chernobyl did. And while some estimates put the death toll for Chernobyl at 50 with the potential for thousands more, the absolute highest estimate for radiation-related deaths from Fukushima is 1. Fukushima was undoubtedly a disaster and something that should be taken very seriously. However, putting Fukushima in the same category as the event synonymous with the worst case scenario hurt its public perception and blew things out of proportion. This, plus confusing evacuation orders and public handling of the incident released by politicians instead of nuclear experts in the chaos after the tsunami, certainly didn't help the international perceptions of the incident. So now that I've talked about a nuclear disaster for a couple of minutes, well, what does this have to do with MotoGP? Well, in 2011, MotoGP was due to race at the Twin Rings Motegi, 130 kilometers from the Fukushima plant, on April 24th, about 6 weeks after the disaster. Obviously, this race couldn't go ahead as planned due to the aftermath of multiple disasters. The race was rescheduled for October 2nd, near the end of the season. However, to those of us who aren't educated on radiation, this still sounds scary, and MotoGP riders thought the same. The stars of the World Championship were quick to react to the news, with Jorge Lorenzo, Casey Stoner, and Valentino Rossi quickly coming out and saying they would not be going to Japan for fear of radiation. And speaking on behalf of the paddock, they indicated that most, if not all, riders agreed with their sentiments. Defending champion Jorge Lorenzo was among the first and most vocal to call for a boycott of the race. He was adamantly against going, saying it was silly to risk the rest of his life over a single race, reportedly citing a documentary he had recently watched about Chernobyl as a source for his concerns. He added that he would attempt to recruit as many riders as possible to join his boycott, and would state many times over the coming weeks that the paddock was in agreement with him. Casey Stoner also came out and said he would not go, again with support from other riders. Valentino Rossi, always playing mind games, let his opponents declare their intentions first, and probably jokingly even proposed a race at Suzuka, a track which had been taken off the calendar nearly a decade prior. However, he too admitted he would not be going given the information they had at the time. Soon after, reports would begin to come out claiming the area was safe, which would be met with resistance by riders, who were still fearful of radiation regardless. Over the coming weeks, Rossi and Lorenzo, rivals on the track, would unite to become leaders of this boycott. The entire roster of active riders, with the notable exclusion of Japanese rider Hiroshi Aoyama, would come out against holding the race in Japan. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and looking at the statistics I mentioned earlier, it's easy to call this a dramatic overreaction. But at the time, the Japanese government and owners of the plant TEPCO weren't exactly being as open as possible about the state of affairs after the event. Part of this can be attributed to the massive scale of damages caused by the earthquake and tsunami, splitting the focus of government officials after the disaster. But to the MotoGP riders concerned for their own safety, the lack of transparency surrounding the Fukushima incident was still troubling. In light of this, the FIM themselves commissioned an independent report about the radiation levels surrounding Motegi to be carried out by Italian agency ARPA. This report would be released in late July, and it showed that the radiation levels in Motegi were negligible, in some cases below the background radiation levels present in Madrid and Rome. In fact, the counts were so low they were considered to be below the detection limit, meaning that the potential error in machinery accounted for a larger range than the radiation numbers detected. And it was determined that riders would receive a bigger dose of radiation on their flights to Motegi than they would by actually spending a weekend there. The biggest concern was radioactive material leaking into inland water sources, potentially contaminating food and drink. Well, this report extended to that as well. ARPA tested a wide variety of food and water samples, and only a single beef sample returned any positive radiation detection. And even that was within the normal limit of radioactive material permitted for food to be imported into Europe. In other words, very low. In light of this report, the FIM made it clear that the race would go on as scheduled, and many riders reluctantly began to change their tune. And eventually, they would all agree to go to Motegi and compete at the event. The race itself proceeded as normal, and while there was no sign of radiation-related trouble at the event, some riders still took some interesting precautions. Eventual world champion Casey Stoner flew in as late as he could possibly afford to, in order to spend as little time in Motegi as possible. Dani Pedrosa claimed he was going to leave all of his clothes in Japan, which begs the question, did he fly back naked? Jorge Lorenzo, the most vocal about the proposed boycott, revealed that he had washed himself with mineral water for fear of contamination. And while some riders expressed they felt the event had gone off without a hitch, Lorenzo added they should check back in a few years, while also taking time to express his love for Japan and its fans, noting that his concerns had nothing to do with the location, only the circumstance. The race itself was somehow almost as chaotic as the lead up to it. The de facto main character of this story, Jorge Lorenzo, had a crummy start off the front row, but not as bad as Andrea Dovizioso, Marco Simoncelli, and Cal Crutchlow, who all jumped the start and received ride-through penalties, with Dovizioso eventually taking his from the lead of the race. Valentino Rossi's day wasn't any better, crashing into Ben Spies before the first lap was out. Stoner and Pedrosa looked like locks out front, with the Australian cruising to what appeared to be yet another controlled win, until he had a massive moment coming down a straight and ran well wide, allowing several riders through and rejoining in 7th place. Eventually, Pedrosa would lead the field home, with Lorenzo in 2nd and Casey Stoner mounting a comeback charge to 3rd, holding his World Championship lead firmly in hand, and eventually winning the title the next time out. Overall, this race represents one of the weirder chapters in MotoGP's history, and a rare example of a race boycott being attempted in modern times. It's one of the few times where this sport has had real crossover with major international happenings, and looking back on it, reading the articles from around the time is fascinating. Anyway, how do you feel about how this was handled? Do you think the riders were right? Do you think they were wrong? Did they overreact? Did they not react enough? Curious to hear your thoughts below. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment down below. It all helps the YouTube algorithm. Press the hype button. Thank you all for watching, and a special thank you to my channel members. MVP 2112, Venturian CRO, Sean, Motosapien, B, Jack the World's Fastest Maori, Drew Gibbs, Really Very Bored 1, Carl Ruppersberg, Friday 42, Troy the Boy, Money Penny, Luis Campos, ASX91, and Ian Ellison. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel the best way possible, click down below to become a member and have your name shouted out at the end of a video. One last thank you very much to everyone for watching, and have a fantastic day.